All right, so right now what I'm going to do is put everyone on mute. And again, if you do need to ask a question, you may use the raise hand option or the chat feature. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. All right, so as Karen mentioned, I currently serve as the special advisor to the Department of Education supporting equity. And so the work that's been done across the 2 years that I've been able to be a part of this work has been primarily focused on what do equitable practices look like in schools? How should it feel? How should it sound? What should we be doing to ensure all of our students are receiving the best supports possible? And so under the guidance of our current acting secretary, Noe Ortega, and our former secretary, Pedro Rivera, this work has been a priority for their administrations. But before we jump into the real content of today, I think it's important to set some agreements on how we'll navigate this space. And so I offer 4 agreements of a courageous conversation. What I would ask is that we consider these 4 agreements, but also think about how we could take potentially these agreements and use them in our respective settings, whether we are SAP teams, whether we are principals of leadership teams, etc. These agreements can really set a firm foundation on how to interact with each other when we're talking about topics that might be a bit sensitive or a bit uncomfortable for people at first hearing. The reason I don't refer to these as norms is simply because as we consider that term, that's often from the mindset of the dominant culture. And in our case, a lot of that is Americanized. And so norms really speak to be respectful. Well, what does respect mean in these various areas that we support? It could look vastly different. And so the term agreements really lends itself to a co-construction or an equal power dynamic that I think really sets the tone. So 4 agreements that I would offer are as follows. Number 1 is to stay engaged. I know we're on Zoom. I know we're also in various roles that keep us from being totally focused on someone speaking through a virtual platform. But I would ask that if you can, to try to stay as engaged as possible in the content and also just participate as much as you can. Understanding that, and I'm aware of, we have a lot of distractions, a lot of things happening, but we would ask that even if the conversation gets a little uncomfortable or if the conversation takes a turn, that we don't shut down or that we don't say, I don't feel comfortable speaking. We want you to also know that it's important to speak your truth, which is the 2nd agreement. We may feel like we can't say what we really think, and we're not in a space where we know each other very well, where that trust is there. But the hope is that if you do have a question about something, or if you do have a comment about something, that if you say it, that it will be received enough to educate and or provide some additional information. So please don't feel that you can't ask a question in this space. It's important to do so. Number 3 is that you will experience discomfort. There will be some things that I say, or even some of our colleagues on the call might say or pose in the chat that might make us kind of sit back a little bit or say, I didn't really feel good about that. That's okay. When you're uncomfortable, that's when change can really occur. When we sit in comfort, that creates complacency, as I'm sure you know. And when you're complacent, things don't tend to shift or move because you're in a good space. And so being uncomfortable creates that urge or that need to move forward or to shift thinking. And then number 4 is to expect and accept non-closure. It's important to always keep in mind that this type of work, these types of conversations aren't solved in 2 hours. They aren't solved in a SAP team meeting that might be a certain amount of time. They're not solved in PLCs that might be 45 minutes. And so we have to keep that in mind, that it's ongoing. And in a moment, I'll talk about how equity is a journey and not a destination. And that's important to keep in mind because sometimes we want to move so quickly so that we can solve the issue. And sometimes the issues are so large that it's impossible to do in a short amount of time. So these agreements were developed by Glenn Singleton. They were developed through his work on courageous conversations about race. However, any courageous conversation, whether it's talking about gender identity, whether it's talking about homelessness, whether it's talking about children of incarcerated parents, Those are courageous conversations that these agreements can really lend themselves to. So I do have a question for you, and what I'd like for you to do, I'm not going to pose all of these questions, but what I would like for you to do at this moment in the chat, if you could, is take a look at that first question. And it is, when was the last time you had to think about your identity, your ethnicity, race, gender, ability, religion, and what provoked you to think about it or acknowledge it? So take a moment, and if you could go into the chat and just put in your thoughts, that would be wonderful. And I'm going to stop share for a moment because I could not see the chat. So let me make sure I have the chat. Okay, and let's get back. Okay, thank you for sharing. So discussions with students about Black Lives Matter, respect and privilege, being keenly aware of your identity in that space. Thank you. When you started teaching using Zoom, yeah, it's different. It's very different. So you're keenly aware of who you are in those spaces. Yes, for sure. Others. Yesterday afternoon, racial affinity group speaking with colleagues. Think about it all the time. Yep. Okay, so now we're talking about religion and voting, how beliefs on race and equality work with children. Yesterday, walking home alone in the evening. In a therapy session with someone from a different culture, needing to think about how to relate in a therapeutic way. Every day, election, family, children, things in the community, parental gender roles, doing home visits. As a white woman, doing research on community-based practices and restorative justice, talking to my own children about political views daily when I hear the news. Take just a couple more. The last time I had to think about my race was when I filled out my voter demographic. They ask you if you're Hispanic as an ethnicity, but then you get to what is your race and nothing fits. Great point. Gender, race, ethnicity at the forefront as an administrator in a predominantly white workforce. Talking to families about barriers to obtaining immunizations. Wow, this is good. This is really, really good. If there's one more, I'll take it. Okay, I think we're good. All right, I'm gonna go back to sharing. Okay, while listening to the news and discussion on votes. So it's so interesting that many of you, the theme that's emerging for me is the thought about the upcoming election. And it's actually a good segue because what this work originated from, whether you believe it or not, and you probably do believe it, was as a result of the 2016 presidential election. Shortly after the results of that election, there were numerous incidents across the Commonwealth that spoke to what we know to be divisions that happen across people, across cultures. And so one that I often reflect on and kind of what the impetus was for this work taking off at PDE was there was a local career tech ed center in one of our counties, and I live in Dauphin County. This was York County. There was a viral video that made national news. And when the election results came out, there were some young people who were excited about the outcome, and they held signs of the president's name and walked down the hall. Now that seems very innocuous, they're just holding a sign. Where it became a problem is as they were walking down the hall holding the sign, they saw students that were of different backgrounds, and they turned towards them with the signs and said, "White power, go back to Mexico, we're building the wall." So they started to spew some of the things that they've heard as a result of the election. Again, someone recorded this, it went on social media and became national news. As a result, Governor Wolf at the time was mortified, obviously, and felt that we needed to really think about how we can support schools when these types of incidents occur, because the outcome of that was then the students who felt marginalized or othered were then feeling this need to stage a sit-in. And so the school really didn't know what to do because they had some staff members who were siding with the young men who held the signs, and they had some staff members who felt that the young people exercising their right to sit in were justified. And so you had adults who were at various ends of the spectrum, you had students, you had a community that was broken, and then you had a director of a career tech center saying, what do I do? And so I'll get to what we did in a moment, but part of what we wanted to do as a result of these incidences, because that was just one that really kind of springboarded the rest as far as the attention. Governor Wolf said the following quote, and I'm not going to read it verbatim, but he highlighted that the principles of the Commonwealth were founded on tolerance, religious freedom, justice, and these are values that Pennsylvanians embrace today. The administration's committed to creating a culture of inclusiveness where students are made to feel welcome and valued, and that we'll continue to work with schools and communities to help them create those supportive environments and settings that celebrate diversity and teach the importance of respect for self and others. So that was in 2017. From there, we now have a definition of what equity can look like. And so as we consider that, we read this definition as such: every student has access to the educational resources and rigor they need at the right moment in their education across all of those various categories that we know are walking into our school buildings. Interestingly enough, when the incident happened in 2016 and then led to the work being done in 2017, fast forward to what we're calling the racial reckoning summer and the summer of COVID, our former secretary, Pedro Rivera, highlighted the vast importance of equitable practices. And so when people hear the term equity, sometimes they often just say, oh, that's just about the Black kids, or that's just about the Latinx kids. And it's really not. As you can see, equity as it stands in our definition is encompassing all. So any student that presents in any type of way deserves and should have an education that provides them what they need at that right moment. And not only what they need in the form of academics, but what they need in the form of a safe environment, whether that's psychological safety, emotional safety, or physical safety. And that's the purpose of equity in Pennsylvania schools. And I just wanted to give that kind of historical background and kind of where we still are and the work that still needs to happen for us to be prepared as much as we can be for November 3rd. Because as we know, and in hearing some of your chat, and seeing some of your chat messages, it's clear that everyone is feeling a sense of urgency and angst around what could be the outcome of the election, and not so much who wins, but what the aftermath will be regardless of the outcome. And so that's my hope in talking to all of you, is to give you some thoughts and strategies on how equity can live in your systems and how you can think about being prepared for anything that's coming your way. And I'm already seeing in the chat people saying, we're having discussions with students about Black Lives Matter. We're having discussions about what's happening in our current climate. And that's important. Our young people need to have those discussions, and they need to see adults having those discussions. And that's why those agreements are so crucial, because they give us some of the skills and tools to be able to engage in those conversations that are not easy to navigate by any means. And so I think it's important to designate or delineate between the distinction of equality versus equity. Often I hear people say, well, everything should be equal. And when we look at that, when it's depicted, you can see that equal doesn't always give students or people what they need at that right moment, going back to the definition Pennsylvania has adopted. So what you see for equality in the picture on the left is that everyone has the same box level. However, all of the students present in different ways. And so if they're all given the same thing, they all don't have access to that quote unquote proverbial blackboard or whiteboard. Over on the right-hand side, where it's equity, that's where students are given what they need at that right moment so that they can access. So if you see the young lady over on the far right, she's in a wheelchair, And she might not necessarily need the whiteboard, but she has assistive technology to support her so that she has the same types of access to content as her peers. And that's the distinction that is so important when we consider equality versus equity. Some would argue that we even need to move beyond equity towards what's called liberation. And with liberation, that's the removal of the barriers that force us to even need to create these different scaffolds. So if you've seen this depicted in other places, you've probably seen a baseball field. And with the baseball field, students are looking over a fence to see the actual game. Some have boxes to help them see over, and some have the equal boxes. And on the equity side, they have the adjustable boxes depending on the height of the person. With liberation, the fence is gone. So the barrier that prohibited them and forced them to need to have the box is no longer there. And that's the ultimate goal of equity, is to move to that final space of liberation where the barriers are dismantled. That's that systemic piece that sometimes is missing when we talk about equity work. And so what is the field saying? Anytime that I've been out training around this topic, people make comments, and they should. I mean, it's the reaction that you expect in some cases, and other times you're kind of like, wow, okay. And that helps you to know maybe how to adjust the content or make the content stick a little better. So one of the things that I heard early on in this work was that equity does not apply to me. We are a rural district and we don't have racial diversity. And that goes back to that misunderstanding. If you're familiar with the Pennsylvania School Boards Association, they have an equity services department, and their lead for that work is Dr. Heather Bennett. And Dr. Bennett has created a continuum of equity for school systems to evaluate where they are. And at the very beginning, or what I would call the bottom of the continuum, the starting place, is this concept of equity as a misunderstanding. And it essentially goes back to that picture I just showed you, where people conflate equality and equity. And so when we look at that first quote, what's happening here is the thought that because we don't have different races in our school, we don't need to talk about equity. When in reality, you may have homeless students, you may have students with disabilities, you may have students with different gender identities, different sexual orientations. And so equity still has a very valid place in the work, no matter what the groups are that you're serving. And I would argue that even if there's not racial diversity, there's still a need to talk about things like that, so that when we have these bigger discussions or students venture out from their original district, let's say they go to a college or they move out of state, that they're not in culture shock when they meet people who are different from them. So exposing them to racial diversity, even if it's not in the seat, it might be in the content you're delivering, it might be in the posters that you have in your school, but that piece is still very relevant and important to ensuring equitable practices. I hear this one a lot. This is just a new buzzword, it's overplayed. And I say, for folks that say that, that's sort of a privilege to be able to say that equity is overplayed and a buzzword. Because for some of us who need equity for our young people or need equity for ourselves in settings, it can't be overplayed. It's important. It ensures that I have access to the things that I need. And so when people say that, I try to, in a very nice way, help them understand that it can't be a buzzword. It may feel like we're saying it a lot, but at this point, it's really important that we know what equity is and how to deliver it. And I'll talk about how COVID-19 has really put a spotlight on that. And I know I'm preaching to the choir in a lot of ways when I speak about that as well. We often hear we aren't doing equity, we're focused on trauma and mental health. So what I would argue here is that in schools, we work in silos, unfortunately, and we kind of put ourselves in these boxes. Okay, we'll do equity this year, and we'll do trauma this year, and we'll do mental health this year, and that's how we'll focus on these things, but we can't do it all at once. That's kind of that feeling of being overwhelmed. And that's not by any means the school's fault. It's the way that things are presented or priorities are pushed down. And so it's important to keep in mind that when we think about equity, that should be the overarching umbrella. So it's not that equity should stand alone. It's not that equity should be a checkoff of a box like you see in that last quote. It should be something that's embedded in everything that we do. And things like focusing on mental health and trauma are equitable practices, because you're creating environments where students who have mental health disorders or symptoms, or students who come from trauma, can thrive in the environments that you're creating. And that's the definition of equity, giving them what they need at that right moment. So I just wanted you to have an understanding on how the word equity, or even the concept of equity, is landing on people in the field. And you may have people in your own settings that feel this same way. So my hope is to create a space where you have some tools to say, yeah, I don't think you're quite right about that. And let's talk about why. So in thinking about that large umbrella, that piece that's so important to really shape our practices, if you're familiar with MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of support, the logo's over here on the right, it highlights the fact that we have a tiered system. So within that tiered system, you have universal practices that happen at the very bottom of this triangle. And that means everybody gets universal practices that, hopefully through a core instructional component, provides them what they need. However, as we saw, some students need a little bit more than that. And in that regard, you move up to tier 2. And in tier 2, that's more of a small group approach, where students are grouped according to their needs, supported through interventions that are matched to their need. And then moving up to tier 3, the very top of the triangle, is more individualized. And when we think about things like SAP, SAP has a clear connection to MTSS because SAP supports students in various ways. And the good thing about MTSS is that we're not just focusing on academics, we're focusing on behavior as well as social emotional competencies. So again, thinking back to your work in your SAP teams, or in the work that you do in your schools that supports mental health, trauma, all of those things can fit within that multi-tiered system of support. And that's what we want the key messaging to be around equity, that we're not necessarily recreating a wheel, but fitting equity and embedding equity into frameworks that already exist in a lot of our school settings. And so when we look at that logo, we have a problem-solving model. And so that's defining the problem, analyzing the problem, implementing a solution, and evaluating how well it went. And that process allows us to know who needs to be at what tier and how to best support them appropriately, with the key word being equitable access for all students. So again, I just want to bring home the message that when we think about equity, it's not a standalone, it's not a checkoff, it can fit within frameworks that exist in our current systems. It's making sure that we're equitable in the practices we deliver within the context of those frameworks. And so when we're looking at educational inequities, we've talked about what equity is, but what creates inequities in schools? And I have over on the right, the spotlight. And the spotlight has been shown on things that a lot of us have known are existing for a long time. However, COVID-19, civil unrest, has really created what I like to call a problemtunity, a problem that has turned into an opportunity. The opportunity being that now we can fully address the inequities that we know exist in education. And the reason these are listed this way is to really give you a clear understanding that inequity is not one sole thing. It's not one sole factor that creates inequitable spaces for students. All of these contributing factors lead to inequities in schools. Some would argue funding is a component of inequities in schools, and I would agree. When we talk about other things though, such as societal inequity, this lends itself to things around how we perceive certain people, how we look at certain families and where they live and things like that. That's societal. Socioeconomic inequity is similar. This is based on class and free and reduced lunch and things, and all of those pieces connected make inequities happen. Cultural inequities, familial, again, thinking about families and what they present. Programmatic inequities, are our students having access at the same rate as their peers to, let's say, AP courses or to gifted placement? Staffing inequities, do we have the most qualified educators at our disposal, or are we having tremendous turnover? Instructional inequity, with those same qualified teachers or highly qualified teachers? Are they providing the same level of instruction depending on the students that they're supporting? Or do they tend to, I hate to say it, lower expectations for certain students? Assessment inequity. When we're evaluating students, are our assessments biased? I'm a school psychologist by training. I can say that when giving IQ measures, which I hated doing, by the way, those questions were so biased. And so it's really unclear on whether or not students that we evaluate through those processes are bona fide students with disabilities in certain cases. And I'm speaking mainly around emotional disturbance and specific learning disabilities. The other categories that we evaluate tend to be a little bit more clear cut, but when we're looking at things like those two categories, they tend to have a lot of subjectivity. And then finally, linguistic inequity. So language barriers that impact how students, families are communicated to and with, and how they're supported within the context of a classroom. So those inequities are really important to know and to start to unpack within your respective systems. So how do we address them? Through the Pennsylvania Department of Education, we have designated what we're calling equity pillars of practice. And these equity pillars of practice are listed here for you. The first one is self-awareness. Second, data practices. Third, family and community engagement. 4, academic equity. And 5, disciplinary equity. The one that is not listed is general equity practices. So in total, there are 6 of them. However, these have been found to be supportive in thinking about how to make those inequities not necessarily disappear, but reduce them to the point that you can continue to problem solve around them and action plan around them. So the one that I think is so important and sometimes gets neglected in this work is self-awareness. The reason why I think that one tends to get overlooked or kind of rushed through is because it's the most uncomfortable. It's the one where you have to start thinking about who you are, how you were raised, the things your parents taught you, the things the media taught you, the things that you saw in school, how you perceive people, how you show up to people, how they show up to you, unpacking power, privileges, bias. That piece is so crucial to this work, but oftentimes is the most difficult to really navigate with people because it's heart work, H-E-A-R-T work. And that type of work takes a lot of time, effort, tears, sweat, everything. And so you can't really do full equitable practices until you've begun that journey. And so I just would want to offer that as we think about self-awareness, and we're going to do some exercises towards the end of the session today to help us start to think about how we could address self-awareness or introduce self-awareness to others in our respective areas, but it's something that we can't skip over. And in a lot of cases, that's what a lot of schools do, because again, they don't want to lose momentum by taking time to do that and maybe alienating some of their staff. So we'll talk more about that. Data practices is also really important. So knowing whether or not we're equitable or not is only going to be told to us through data. So things like disproportionality, are certain students receiving outcomes differently than their peers? Perception data, are we giving surveys to families, to students, to stakeholders, to school boards to know how they perceive our systems? All of that data is important to help us shape the practices. That then lends itself to family and community engagement. And I would argue that the key word missing there is authentic. So family and community engagement by law cannot be one way. It should be two-way communication. So oftentimes schools, rightfully so, send out newsletters, do website blasts, send out announcements via phone message system, all well and good. What's often missing though is that loop back, the family back to the school, communicating back to the school on what it is that they want and need as far as supporting their students. And that takes some intentionality on the school's part to create that space where engagement is welcomed and supported. And again, we'll talk more about that in a moment. We then have academic equity. Academic equity, again, speaks to access and opportunity. So thinking about, again, that access to AP courses, access to special education placement, access to gifted placement, access to whatever you want to add. So anything that students typically are not so much denied, but maybe haven't had access in the past, or there's a barrier that we haven't really unpacked yet that is prohibiting them from accessing that, that's academic equity. We can really think about COVID-19 in the context of this, where there were districts and continue to be districts who do not have Wi-Fi or do not have devices, and yet content was being provided via those mechanisms. That's a form of inequity via academic access and opportunity. So a lot of places have, and thankfully PDE was a partner in this, have partnered with their public broadcasting stations. So PBS has connected to PDE and said, we'll broadcast content to those deserts in our state, and not even just the deserts, across all of our systems, our channels, to ensure that some content is being delivered in some form or fashion. And then lastly, disciplinary equity. Disciplinary equity is mainly focusing on behavior and looking at suspensions, expulsions, looking at how to make a better school climate so those behaviors decrease and so that there's a sense of belonging. And what we know to be true, sadly, is that in Pennsylvania, the amount of instructional time lost due to suspensions impacts Black boys and Latinx boys much more than their peers. And so with that, we have to start to unpack, why is that? Why are suspensions occurring more often for those pockets of students than others? And what could we potentially start to think about as mitigating those outcomes? What steps and practices could we put in place? We'll talk about that in a moment. So I just want to highlight one piece for you, and then I'll jump right back into content. If you have teachers or staff that are interested in taking a deeper dive at the classroom level on what they can do around equity, we have 2 Act 48 courses that they can access via our SAS portal. And the website is www.pdesas.org. And if you were to go there, if you're not familiar with that website, there's a course catalog once you log in, and you can put in the names of these 2 courses and they will populate for you. I've shared with Karen that I will create a PDF of this PowerPoint that will be shared with you after today's session so that you have access to these slides and also the content that's embedded within them. I would highly encourage you to have teachers take advantage of this. It is free, it's self-paced, so they can take their time completing it. And it really does speak to what I highlighted earlier, which is self-awareness and reflection in the classroom, and then also how do you as classroom teachers serve as system change agents. So just wanted to highlight that this is something that can further your understanding of equity in the classroom setting. Okay, so as we think about those pillars of practice, another key release that came out September 21st, 2020 is the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. And so you heard me articulate the current pillars of practice, and they're listed here again for you. If you've not seen this yet, I do want to just briefly show you what it looks like. So if you were to visit the PDE website, I'm going to take us out to it right now. And I'm actually going to take us all the way back to the first page. So if you just Google PDE, it will come up. If you scroll down to the very bottom, it's right here in the center. And you click there, and it takes us to the Equitable Practices Hub. It gives an orientation, if you will, to what is equity within the context of education. It provides you with the definition that you heard me say earlier around the right moment. And then it talks about the pillars. And each of the pillars are listed here with very clear, concise questions, just so people know what it is they're looking for. And then it's broken down into spheres. And those spheres are what we call spheres of influence. So anyone familiar with Joyce Epstein's work from Johns Hopkins University, she talks about the student being at the core circle, and then spheres of influence kind of encapsulate that young person. We tried to, as much as we could, mimic that thought. So we have a district school sphere, which might be more for an administrator, a superintendent, a principal to look at, classrooms focusing on teachers, and then individual. So we ourselves, what can we do in our respective roles to support equitable practices? So before you begin, there is an audit tool that you can engage around, as well as a companion action planning guide to support your efforts. For time's sake, I won't go into each of these, but I want you to just know that it's here. And then as you scroll down, you can see each of the pillars are listed here. So if we wanted to go to disciplinary equity, for instance, you would click there. There's a description provided on what disciplinary equity looks like and what it could be and mean. And if I'm a superintendent or a principal, I might go to district school. If I'm a classroom teacher, I'm going here to classroom. And if I just individually want to know more about disciplinary equity and what I can do on an individual level, I'm going to individual. For now, for this example, I'm going to go to district school. And what you can see is that each of these are broken down into topics. So it's using engaging instruction, a behavior framework, disaggregating data, policies, and teaching strategies for neutralizing implicit bias in discipline decisions. And so you can click on any one of these. I'll click on this last one, and it takes you directly to the core resources that have been vetted and seen as top level to support your efforts regarding any of these particular topics. So I just wanted you to know that this is available and you can access it at any time, and also feel free to share it with as many people as you like. We're looking to refresh the hub quarterly. So by December, there will be newer resources added. But for now, this is the foundational hub, and we hope that you would find it to be useful. So before we take a break, I'll put this link in the chat box, but I just wanted you to have a brief tour of what it is so that you can access it after we're done today. Okay. So in the 10 minutes before we take a break, what I'd like to do is just highlight the importance of language. And so as we know, language matters. So when we talk about different things, if we're not consistent in understanding, that creates confusion, that creates mistrust, that creates a whole lot of things that we don't necessarily want. And so I just wanted to offer some definitions that I think might ground us in understanding. So the first one is culturally relevant pedagogy, and then culturally responsive teaching. You may have heard these two kind of interchangeable. And I think it's important to delineate between the two and also understand how the two can somewhat connect. So when we talk about culturally relevant pedagogy, this is the act of teaching or lessons where students can begin to be affirmed in their identity and also develop those critical thinking skills that help them to have voice, to know when to stand up, to say, this isn't equitable, or this isn't fair, and what can I do about that? Those are skills that we would want young people to have the ability to do when they graduate and even beforehand. So culturally relevant pedagogy speaks to that. It lends itself to creating a space where students can be themselves authentically and also speak up when they need to, when they see that injustices or inequities are imposing on them. The difference with that to culturally responsive teaching is that culturally responsive teaching really speaks to cultural references in all aspects of the learning. So this might be seeing people that look like them in the curriculum, or seeing people that look like them in posters or in documents or in ways that they typically wouldn't see. So when we talk about curriculum, for instance, if we're looking at, let's say, World War II, we're talking about all of the different battles that took place, but oftentimes we have a very Americanized version of those events. We don't always talk about, let's say, Japanese Americans who were interred during that time. That's a way to infuse culturally responsive teaching, to provide multiple perspectives for young people to be able to form their thoughts and understanding of, let's not only say historical events, but things related to scientific history, things related to English language arts, the books that we read, all of those things. So these two things somewhat exist together and should, but I think it's important to understand the difference between the two and how the two of them should be considered whenever we have all different types of students together in a classroom, or even if we don't. This type of work is important for not only our students of color, but our white students as well. We also can talk about inclusive environments. And this is this concept of inclusivity that sometimes is just thrown out. And we're inclusive. We include everyone. Well, what does that really mean? And when we think about that, it's fostering a sense of belonging through a culture of dignity. So seeing the humanity in all of the young people that are there, as well as the staff members who are a part of that system. The other term that often gets said a lot is belonging. So experiencing appreciation, validation, acceptance, and fair treatment within an environment. And this is the part that I really think is crucial. When people feel that they belong, they aren't distracted and worried about being treated as a stereotype or a singular part of their multidimensional personhood. And that definition really resonates with me. Because if we think back to that affirming identity and making a space where students feel that they can say things and have a voice, this belonging is exactly what we should see. And it's not being worried of being perceived in a certain way. So I'll be as transparent as I can right now. When I enter into spaces, virtual or not, and I'm talking about things like that, like this, it's not lost on me that I'm a Black woman speaking to all of you from my lens. How that can be perceived by some is, oh, here we go again. Another Black person telling us what we're doing wrong, or she's an angry Black woman. All of those perceptions can influence the lens through which you see me and hear me. With belonging, I wouldn't be worried about that. If there was a true sense of belonging, I wouldn't feel that I'm being perceived in any sort of way, and I don't have to worry about being treated as a stereotype. That would be the goal. That's not something that happens overnight. That's creating trust. And that's creating a space of trust and levels of comfort for people that may have otherwise been othered, for lack of a better term, or seen in a different way. So it is 9:45. I think before I go into the next set of our content, I'm going to go ahead and break now and just ask for us to come back by 9:55. So still a 10-minute break. But if you could just come back at 9:55, that would be great. And please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Okay, we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Folks, we have about 1 more minute and then we'll resume.
Nicole?
Yes.
Would you remind everyone to sign in at chat, on the chat?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure. So folks, it is 9:55. If you could do me a favor and please go to the chat feature, the chat box, and please put in your name and organization, that would be amazing. We really appreciate that. I'll give you a minute to do so. Just a friendly reminder, if you're just rejoining us, if you could just go ahead and put your name and organization in the chat box. That's our way of maintaining a sign in. Please do so. Thank you. Karen, any other housekeeping items before we move on?
Only to mention that you will be receiving by email an evaluation, and many of your administrators have agreed to give you Act 48 hours. So your ticket to those hours would be me receiving that evaluation. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, we're going to go ahead and resume. So thank you everybody for rejoining. I'm hopeful that the content thus far has been useful, and I'm hoping that the remaining time we share together, you'll be able to feel that you can participate more. I feel like I've been just talking at you, so I apologize for that. But I just want to give some foundational content and then hopefully get your feedback in a moment. As we go through the equity terms that I think are really important for our understanding, the next set speak to anti-racism, institutional racism, and implicit bias. During this racial reckoning summer, it's been important to really understand these terms. You've probably heard them a lot, but some may not fully understand how they connect to equity or may conflate them with equity. And so what I would offer before even unpacking these is that things such as being anti-racist fit within that self-awareness pillar that I talked about earlier. That's understanding who you are, how to figure out whether or not things that you do intentionally or not lend themselves to institutional racism. And so that's a component of equity, but I think sometimes when schools, for instance, and this has happened, reach out for training around equity, when you start to talk more to them, what they really want to do is talk about anti-racism work. And that work is very different in some ways and more nuanced and requires people who are very skilled in taking people down that journey. And so I would just offer that as a word of caution for those that are on the call that set up trainings for districts or what have you. When folks say we want equity training, being clear on what it is that they're asking for so that the best person possible can support them. I probably don't have to tell you that as a result of a lot of the focus on these topics, there are a lot of people who now say that they know how to train on equity or they know how to train on anti-racism. And I would just caution you to be very strategic in who you select to partner to ensure that they are really the right fit for your system when you embark on that journey. It would be horrible to start that work with someone who's not really a good fit for your system and then to have the work fall apart. So I would just offer that as a word of caution. As we talk about anti-racism, this is being active and consistent in a process of change. And again, that self-awareness piece can't be understated when we talk about that. It's being able to know and recognize what we would consider individual, institutional, and systemic racism. Institutional racism, I've provided a definition here for you, are within policies and practices that are in institutions, whether intentional or not, and produce outcomes that, whether we realize it or not, favor a certain racial group or put another group at a disadvantage. So just for an example, when we think about, let's say, hair, something as arbitrary as hair, there are policies that some schools have adopted, that school boards have adopted nationally that police, for lack of a better term, hair. So if certain students have, let's say, locks, or they wear a do-rag, or they wear a bonnet, or they have their hair out, for lack of a better term, natural, sometimes those are seen as inappropriate hairstyles for schools. Those are institutional policies that disadvantage one group based on their cultural expression. And so those are the things we're talking about when we think about how to dismantle some of those systemic barriers that in the form of policy influence and lend themselves to institutional racism. That's just one example. The other piece that's important to understand is the concept of implicit bias. And implicit bias is a mental process that really stimulates a negative attitude about people who are not members of our own in-group. So when we talk about that, implicit is exactly what it means. It's unconscious. We don't typically even recognize that it's happening. And when we do recognize, we're oftentimes conflicted and we feel as though we're having some dissonance, like that's not really who I am. So why did I think that? Why did I pull my person closer when the Black man walked past me? Or why did I assume that the person in the wheelchair, whatever? It's all of these things that we have biases against, we have biases around, I should say, that really inform how we react and respond to people. So when we think about in-group, Bias in this sense can encompass so many different things. In-group could be, and I use this example all the time, I graduated from Millersville University. If I see other people from Millersville, I'm connected to them in some way. If I see people from Westchester, which was our rival, I don't necessarily look favorably on them. And that's not a dig, it's just I favor my in-group. Unconsciously, without recognizing it, that bias influences how I react and respond to people that are outside of that in-group. So if you're constantly fed messages about certain people in certain ways, they start to stick. And in that sticking, those biases form. Now, there are some who would argue that implicit bias is something we've just kind of blanketed around all types of bias. And that's not accurate. There is a form of explicit bias where it's outward, it's in your face, it's clear. And then others are most often, all of us have some form of an implicit bias that we don't even recognize gets triggered by certain things that we encounter. We see this all the time when we talk about discipline and things such as disrespect, defiance, or disruption, things that are highly subjective. Our implicit bias tends to take over when we make decisions related to discipline. If a student rolls their eyes, for some of us, that's a trigger that makes our implicit bias go off. I don't like when people roll their eyes at me. I don't care what the reason was, she's automatically out of my class. Those types of decisions come out of that background or that backpack that we carry that creates our way of showing up to others. And so I want to give you this quote. If you're not familiar with James Baldwin, he is amazing. I wish that he were still around because I know he would have quite a lot to say about our current climate. If you've not heard of James Baldwin, I highly recommend that you Google him and or go to YouTube and look for his debate in Oxford. He was the first African-American to do a formal debate at Oxford University, I want to say in 1965. And if you were to listen to him, you would swear that he was talking to us right now. But one of the things that he says is that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that's so important because when we think about things like disproportionality, inequity, institutional racism, bias, power, privilege, we oftentimes don't want to go there. It's taboo. Let's not talk about it. We don't need to think about that. We all don't have those things. When in reality, the only way to change the outcomes that we're seeing is to start to unpack those things that we know live inside of us and societally have been created for some of us. And it's not to say that all of us don't have a privilege of some kind, all of us don't have a bias of some kind, because we all do. It just depends on the types of privileges and biases that we hold. So what contributes to disproportionality? It's vast and complex. So you can see there are a variety of things that create disproportionate outcomes. And just for clarity, disproportionality is either an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation of a group compared to another group. So in this case, what we see a lot of in what we see as far as discipline, let's just start with discipline policies and practices, is oftentimes an overrepresentation of certain groups of students when compared to their peers. And as I said, nationally and in state, Black males and Black girls tend to be receive more punitive discipline, let me put it that way, than their peers. That's disproportionate. Same thing when we think about underrepresentation and let's say access to STEM courses for females compared to males. Underrepresentation is also a form of disproportionality. And so things like instruction and assessment, that creates a space on who has access, who doesn't. Teacher expectations and misconceptions, that lends itself again to that bias. Not really thinking that students that live on that side of town can do as well as others, or their families don't care about education. These are all things that I know we've all heard. They create spaces where disproportionality can live. And Kent McIntosh from the University of Oregon would say that ambiguity is disproportionality's best friend. So when things are ambiguous, when we aren't clear in what we expect and what we want, that ambiguity lets our brains kind of run wild and that bias can take over. Another component is cultural dissonance, and that's that disconnect, that mismatch between cultures that happens. So another example I often give is if you have a young, let's say Asian American young lady in a school, she's with her teacher, they've had a disagreement, they're standing face to face, the young lady keeps her head down as the teacher talks to her, and the teacher continuously says, "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." That's cultural dissonance, because American culture says eye contact is a form of respect, whereas this young lady's culture may say that no eye contact is a form of respect, and they're mismatched. And so what can often happen is outcomes such as go to the office, a write-up, anything like that, because there's a misunderstanding between the two cultures that are trying to talk together. So all of those things, again, I won't unpack each one of them, but they contribute to overall disproportionality. And these are things we have to be able to recognize when we see them through things like the pillars, the data practices, the family and community engagement, academic equity, etc. So how do we become culturally responsive? As many of you know, in education, we have to have some shape or some depiction to represent what we want to say. So here's some circles for you. As we think about this, though, I want you to take in mind that as we look at cultures and being equitable, the 3 Ps are necessary: people, policies, and practices. Each of them influence the other. People being you and I, students, families, communities, anyone. We contribute to that overall system. Within the context of the people, we inform policies. Those policies give direction on how to execute practices. So again, each of them are intertwined. However, policy drives practice. And so when we think about, let's say, students who are transgender, and we think about using bathrooms and locker rooms, policies had to shift based on the people that we were supporting. And through that, practices then are to change based on those policies. There's a lot of contention around some policies, and ones that I highlighted earlier, talking about hair, dress code, all of those things. But those policies, when equitable, really inform practices that can shape and make change. And so what I want to highlight here is from Wisconsin. I wish that Pennsylvania could take credit for this because I think it's amazing. But when you look here, when we think about systems, often what we're looking for to make systems change, and I'm going to speak primarily to education, is a coalition of the willing. So the people who have the desire to want change, the desire to want to lead, the desire to want to see growth happen, that's the will. And so within that yellow part of the circle, the will part is becoming self-aware, which you've heard me say, examine the system's impact on families and students, being able to do that data dive. What often happens though, is that in our systems, we move from will to skill, desire, and then apply, desire, and then put into action. And so the green part, speaks to what are the practices? Do we accept institutional responsibility? Are we leading and modeling and advocating? What is missing often is the blue, which is fill. And that's gaining cultural knowledge of the space that you're in. So all of your families, students, communities bring something to the decision-making table that's important. And if we don't fill ourselves with the cultural understanding or the cultural knowledge, or what some would say, cultural humility, the willingness to be humble enough to say, I don't know everything, teach me about it, help me understand, then the skill won't be as intentional or impactful. So fill is believing all students will learn, understanding those unique identities, and knowing communities. So that will, fill, and skill is so important. And I think, again, as we consider equitable systems and being culturally responsive, we have to know that we're doing the blue part before we can move to green, and being culturally responsive in our green practices. So I just wanted to leave you with kind of with that thought about, it's okay to want to do well. It's okay to have the desire, but to actually execute it, you need those other 2 components. And this just highlights what I just went over, and just also a reminder that being culturally responsive is a journey. It's not a final destination. So there's no way to say we have arrived. what you can say is that our system is starting to change in a positive way. We're starting to see our data change. And that journey is continuous because students change, families and communities change. So we need to be able to adjust and adapt and change along with them. So I have a question for you. Who are you? And if anyone has seen Alice in Wonderland, the Disney version, it reminds me of the caterpillar when he's like, who are you? So think about that question. And I have this one for you. Suppose you are on a boat with your mother, your spouse, and your child. Suddenly the boat begins to sink. You determine that you can save only one of the other passengers. Whom do you save? Go ahead and put in the chat who you would save. Daughter, child. Kimberly, I'm with you. I would die trying to save them all. Yep. Child and spouse. Better save my mother. I got you, Jess. Okay. Child. Yep. Okay. Tie them together and I would get out the boat. Wow, Delia. These are such good responses. Thank you, guys. Okay, so when we look at this, oftentimes, and this ties back in, so don't think I'm crazy by posing this question, but the reason I'm posing it is to think about the concept at the top, which is cultural competence. So for the majority of you, you said child. And for American culture, that is typically what you see. We are very children focused. And so in other cultures, the mother is esteemed. And so everyone else can go, but I have to save my mother because I can have another baby, I can marry someone else, but I only get one mother. And so cultural competence speaks to the fact that if we were to hear someone say, my mother, and give a reason, cultural competence would say that we would respect that and not judge it and be, oh my God, I can't believe you wouldn't save your baby. And that's oftentimes what happens when we're not as competent as we could be culturally, because cultures present in such different ways. So just wanted you to kind of have that exercise. This next exercise is a little bit more nuanced. So think about your school. So I'm going to read this out for you, not verbatim, but just to give you an overview and then ask you a question to put in the chat. So Columbus School District is a mid-sized urban school district. It's about 10,000 students. However, enrollment's been on a decline based on poor academic performance and the reputation of the district. One of the school principals in the school, who's a native to the area, has a strong desire to shift the morale. Think back to that will. She has the will. She wants to shift the morale of the staff at her building and wants them to think about how to support students through academics, behavior, and social emotional learning. So here we go. At a kickoff faculty meeting, the principal starts the meeting by asking each staff member to reflect upon his or her favorite teacher and why they chose that person. After the activity, she asks the staff to think about their implicit biases and how that impacts student achievement. One staff member walks out of the meeting and says that the issues are not about what they as staff are doing wrong, but rather the students and community just aren't willing to be educated. He goes on to express that the students aren't interested in education, but rather being quote unquote out in the street. And how can school compete with that? The principal tries to understand the staff member's perspective, but insists that these types of activities will be provided throughout the school year, and it is imperative that all members participate. The question I pose to you, when attempting to achieve buy-in from staff, did the principal approach this meeting in a way to meet that goal? And the second part of the question is, what are some other recommendations that you'd suggest for this principal to consider? So take a couple minutes, and no right or wrong answer, just want to see where your thoughts are. I know we have some principals on the call, so I'm really curious what your thoughts are here. Okay. Ms. Melfi, I would suggest having them think of their favorite person rather than teacher because maybe, great point, maybe their educational experience did not create room for a favorite teacher. Then apply those character traits and skills of their favorite person and assess why they deem them their favorite. What was the connectivity? John said, I would start with a discussion and building empathy and understanding with the current community rather than reflecting on the past and past visions of education. These are great, keep them coming. I think the principal had good intentions, but I think that there was a clear understanding that staff morale was an issue. I would do more work to lay the foundation. Wait, it's moving fast. You guys are too fast for me. Hold on. Let me go back up. Oh, come on. Okay. I would do more work to lay foundation of the students by having us focus on ourselves. We assume that if it worked for us, it should work for our students. Good point. This will tell me that I need to have more trainings. Yep. I think that the principal attempted to do that. Maybe you could have a training such as this one to help the staff understand this purpose and goals. Yeah, so definitely feeling like we may have jumped the gun a little bit with this particular principle. So let me ask you this. In thinking about how, yep, thank you, Lauren, skip the fill piece, absolutely. When you think about the teacher who walked out, what do you think about that? And how do you think you could maybe restore some form of connection, or is it too late? And I'm only asking these hypotheticals. You don't necessarily have to answer. Lisa just said, did not meet her goal. Teaching understanding about implicit bias is foundational. I totally agree. Once established, build from there. So this is an example of intentions being good. So this principal, she's a native, she's really committed to this district, she wants to see it grow. And so she probably attended a training, maybe like this, and then said, I'm gonna duplicate it. And I'm just gonna go with implicit bias right off the top. And as you can see, in this instance, and probably in others, the staff member was really offended, he walked out. Now I've had people, when we do this, completely mortified by the teacher walking out and saying the principal needs to address him, needs to talk to him and figure out what that was. And I agree, I think there needs to be a deeper conversation with that person to understand what was going on. But I think it's important to have case studies like this because these are real life scenarios that really play out. And so you have a principal who wanted to do this work, probably a group that wanted to do it as well, but didn't necessarily handle the approach in the best possible way to get the buy-in to make the work progress. And that goes back to that, who you engage with to support your staff around work like this is really critical because it can make or break, literally. And our students' lives are at stake that we can't afford for it to break, if that makes sense. Okay. So this then leads me to what's called the cultural proficiency continuum. Oops, sorry about that, yikes. So what I would like for us to think about as I kind of talk us through each part of the continuum is not only think about yourselves individually, but also think about the systems that you're in. So whether it is a school system, whether it's an organization, what have you, think about maybe where your system fits currently on this continuum. And if you can't really think about that, think back to the principal here and where maybe her system is fitting in the continuum. So the first piece at the very bottom is called cultural destructiveness. And cultural destructiveness is seeking to eliminate the cultures of others in all aspects. And so what that means, essentially, if we think about from a global perspective, this would be like a genocide, trying to get rid of a certain group of people to remain pure. But when we think about it, not so much in that regard, but in how we see things happen in our systems, school systems, I'll use that. This may sound like if we didn't have the special education kids, our scores would be higher. That's a form of cultural destructiveness at its core. Basically, if this group of students weren't here, our school would be so much better. If we rezoned and moved the students in the trailer park to that school and not our school, we would be better off. That is what cultural destructiveness looks and sounds like. As we move up, we have cultural incapacity, which is trivializing and stereotyping other cultures. Now, before I even go further, because I feel like I missed something here, when I talk about cultures, I'm not just referring to ethnic or racial cultures. I'm talking about cultures that exist anywhere. Homelessness, children of incarcerated parents, gay, lesbian, transgender. So when you hear me say cultural, I just want your brains to expand to include all of those when we think about these different levels. And that might help with where you may place your system. So cultural incapacity is trivializing and stereotyping other cultures. So this might be an example of, let's say you have a district who has hired a whole new upper administration, new superintendent, new assistant sup, new curriculum director, everyone. The new superintendent, however, is Latino, let's say, and he or she has brought in a whole new group of administrators that look like them and represent that culture or what have you. And someone who's been in the district for a while says, it's mighty Latino at the top, trivializing and stereotyping that culture is a form of incapacity. As we move up, this one we could spend an entire day training on, and that's cultural blindness. Not noticing or acknowledging the culture of others and ignoring discrepant experiences. So this would be from an individual space, someone saying, I don't see color. Intentions are good, impact not so good. Reason being, and this is why it sits in the middle of the continuum, someone who says, I don't see color, oftentimes is saying, I see you for who you are, regardless of how you look. However, what that also says to the person in receipt of that is that you don't see me at all because who I am is my color, is my culture. So that's why blindness sits in the middle. The other way that you could look at blindness in the form of a system level would be a system that says, oh, we don't have a problem here. Everyone's happy. There's no issues here. What do you mean? So if there's one person who does say they have an issue, then that person's the problem. It can't be us. And so that's a form of cultural blindness at a systemic level. So again, I want you to just keep thinking about where you think your system or even yourselves might fall. And what I would offer is the arrow over on the left, the red one that goes up and down, is indicative of how, depending on the situation, we all can move up and down this continuum. So keep that in mind too. No one sits in one place forever, hopefully. We move up and down. Pre-competence, increasing awareness, either moving in a constructive direction or faltering and stopping. There are a lot of districts right now who are sitting at pre-competence, meaning they have the will, they want to do something different, they want to start dismantling these barriers. However, they either are taking their time and they're moving in a constructive way, or they're like our principal previously, who kind of maybe shot herself in the foot and it might stop because either he or she may not know what to do next, or they've alienated so many people that they just can't get it up and running again. That's pre-competence. So you're moving in an upward way, but there's the risk of either moving back down into what we would call the peach area or moving up into the upper tiers of the continuum. This takes us to cultural competence, aligning personal values to be inclusive of cultures that are new or different and healthy interactions. So a lot of school systems want and need to be at least at the competency level where there's open dialogue. So when I saw someone put in the chat, I had a conversation with students about Black Lives Matter, about the election, about voting. That is a form of cultural competence because it's a healthy interaction. It's a dialogue that's happening. It's thinking about your own personal values and views and being able to understand and respect the different views that might come to you, as we did with that who would you save question. And then lastly is sort of what we would call the utopia or the panacea, and that's proficiency. Holding the vision for creating a socially just democracy, lifelong learning to serve all. What I would argue here is that no one is perfect. And just like in teaching with the Danielson framework, where they say no one lives indistinguished because there's always room to grow, the same could be said here. There will be times when you will be proficient, but there will be other times when you may say something in the blindness space or in the incapacity space, or your system might move up and down with different shifts in leadership or shifts in teams. But this continuum can help you ground yourselves in where you would like to be and also assess where you are. So I just wanted to give you that kind of grounding as you think about where your systems currently sit. And I'm going to pause actually to see if there are any questions about this continuum before we move on. Feel free to put them in the chat if there are. Okay. If you do have questions as I go through, don't hesitate. So what are the barriers to cultural proficiency? They're listed here for you. And the book that this work comes out of, if you would like to take advantage of it, is Cultural Proficiency for School Leadership by Randall Lindsay. It came out in 2019. This is the 4th edition. And this book to me has been a godsend. It really helps to understand cultural proficiency, how it can be used in schools in particular. And so they talk about what the specific barriers are. And the one is presumption of privilege and entitlement. And that really speaks to this thought of, why should we change anything? We're fine, we're getting what we need. That's the feeling of privilege and entitlement. Another barrier would be systems of oppression. So those policies that I said are in place that really don't lend themselves to folks being able to feel that they belong. Think back to that definition of belonging, not worrying about being a stereotype, being your authentic self, being able to share yourself. Unawareness of the need to adapt. So totally oblivious. If we think back to the blindness piece, we don't have a problem. There's no issue here. And then resistance to change. Change is hard. Change means we're going to have to adjust. And a lot of us are resistant to change in our everyday life. So when we think about a larger systemic change, that resistance is even greater. And so those tend to be the key barriers that you see related to cultural proficiency, to reaching that panacea or that pinnacle. So what do those barriers sound like in schools? They're listed here. Their parents won't come to parent conferences because they don't care about the education of their children. Why try to help them? They'll just end up in jail just like their dad. Why should I learn anything about their culture? This is our country. Let them learn about us. Don't put these kids in my class. I'm not a special ed teacher. Real life quotes, folks. And I'm sure you've heard them. And that is what prohibits us from moving forward when we want to reach cultural proficiency. And so it's hard to say, this is how you should respond when this happens, because there's no one size fit all. However, it's being able to recognize when you can see these barriers play out in the comments that you hear, and then thinking about, maybe I could ask a follow-up question. And so teachingtolerance.org, I would highly recommend that you access, and it's actually tolerance.org is the website. That's all you have to type in, it'll pop right up. They have a responding to bias pocket guide that's available for students, but also for adults. So when things like these comments come up, there's 4 steps that you can do. One is to interrupt, 2 is to question, 3 is to educate, and 4 is to echo. So interrupt, not sure why, or to say something like, would you just say, or just kind of, what's going on? And then number 2, question, help me understand what you mean. Not putting anyone on the spot, just trying to understand. Number 3 is to educate. That's not been my experience with X, Y, or Z group. I've always found them to be, and explain yourself. And then number 4 is to echo. So if you have someone that's standing next to you that supports your quote unquote argument or your statement, they should echo that statement so that the person that you're addressing can start to see that it's not just a you thing, that maybe you weren't just the only one offended or felt put off by the comment, that there can be an educational circle that takes place. So that 4-step process has been found to work. Obviously, it doesn't work for everyone, but it provides a skill set or a toolbox for you to go to when you hear some of these things being said, not only for adults, but also for students. And so I just want to ask this self-reflection question, and I'm going to change the question for the purposes of the chat. From a scale to 1 to 5, how comfortable do you feel in responding when others make negative statements towards individuals that are different? And you see all of the categories. 1 would be very uncomfortable, 5 would be very comfortable. And go ahead and put that number in the chat. A lot of 4s and 5s. 3s. Thank you for that honesty. Yep. Depends on the person. Amy, I'm so with you. Yep. Depends on the situation. 3. And I'm going to venture to guess that folks that are putting 3 are probably in the same mindset, that it depends. Or you're someone like me who doesn't particularly like confrontation. And so with that, it might make my number a little lower. Any others? It depends. Just had that come up in a meeting and I didn't say anything. Yeah, that's happened to me too. So it happens all the time, actually. And I can, again, be transparent. In the role that I serve, I have to be very cautious sometimes of what I say and how I say it, because I'm representing the Department of Education, and that can be taxing because sometimes you hear or are told things directly that are very uncomfortable and very off-putting. And so, Delia, I'm so with you. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. But sometimes you think back after the occurrence and you're like, I wish I would have said something. I should have said something. And that's a growth thing. Like, that takes time. And I'm starting to learn now different ways to say it without being as direct as I would like to be. But sometimes I have to think about me not speaking up creates a burden for the young people I'm supposed to be supporting. And Paul Gorski dropped that gem to me, and he actually did a training on it. And he said, so often we're so worried about, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but sometimes if we don't, we allow the burden to then be pushed to the young people that we want to see supported. And sometimes that's the voice that I have to put in my head and say, okay, I know this may not land well, but I'm going to have to say it anyway and just deal. So Delia, you and I are very much alike in that regard. So I appreciate you sharing that. Jess, that's a good point too. Not feeling comfortable or fluent enough to do that education piece of the STEP process. Yeah. So I would just say it takes practice, it takes time, but I would say that your voices are valuable. So as much as you can, when you're feeling like you have that ability, it's important to do it. Okay, so it's 10:35 already. I'm hoping, and Karen will kill me, but I'm hoping we can get through as much of the rest of the content. Whatever we don't get through, maybe Karen, we can do a part 2 or something else if you think that would be great. I don't mind, I'm happy to do so if we don't get through everything in the next 20, 25 minutes. Okay, so what is implicit bias? At the very beginning, I provided you with some self-reflection questions. I just want to remind us of what some of those are. So we actually did 2. We did the last time you thought about your identity. We just did how do you respond, or your level of comfort. And then the last 2, I just kind of want to pose to you. No need to put in the chat. How do you feel when you're in a community that is different than your neighborhood? These are just self-reflection questions. And if you recognize your privilege, what did you do with this realization? So just some questions to kind of keep in your head and also kind of problem solve on your own that impact implicit bias, privileges, power, etc. So one of the key words that is a trigger for a lot of people is privilege. And if you've been following the news cycles lately, there's been a lot of discussion about should we even talk about things like privilege from a federal level. And that has become interesting to kind of see play out. And it's interesting to me because privilege is not something that I don't think we should run away from. I think it's important to know that these things exist and have existed in society for many different people. So I'm privileged because I have a degree. I'm privileged because I am a heterosexual woman. These are privileges that we all possess in certain ways. However, societally, there are certain privileges that create institutional barriers for some people. And so when we talk about, let's say, white privilege, I'm not referring to a singular white person when I mention white privilege. What I'm referring to is the concept of societal white privilege and how there are privileges that are afforded to certain people, regardless of their background, that create institutional barriers. And so when we are doing this type of work, it starts by discussing how privilege looks in our society, which groups have privilege and which do not. So that, I hope I just provided that example of how societally these privileges exist. It's relative to each individual's lived experience. It doesn't require feeling guilty for your privilege. It's just acknowledging that the privilege exists. And then determining and offering ways to challenge systems of privilege and oppression in your own life. So I can only speak for me and the lens that I live through. As a Black woman, I don't necessarily want people to say, I'm so sorry. You know, when George Floyd happened and all of the things that happened this summer, I wanted people to take the power and the privileges they have and transform the system. So saying I feel guilty or what have you doesn't do anything for anyone. Using that privilege for good creates a space where my now child, my son, might have a better world. That's what I would want to see when we have discussions like this. So I want to just kind of give us another quick orientation on implicit bias. We generally tend to hold those biases that favor our own in-group. I talked about that. These, believe it or not, are malleable. They can change. They're also pervasive. We all have them. The difference is implicit are the things that we don't even sometimes know are happening, whereas explicit are outward, they're in your face. And what's interesting is that the associations that we hold, like the messaging that we have about certain people, don't always necessarily connect or jive with our declared beliefs. So that's why you sometimes have dissonance and say, why did I just say that? Or why did I just do that? Because you don't really believe, in some cases, the things that you just exhibited because it's unconscious. So that's implicit bias. But what we're seeing more of is the explicit outward demonstrations that we know exist in our society. So as you think about this, these again are just reflection questions. Who are your 3 best friends? And not necessarily their names, but just think about the characteristics that they have. How did they become your best friends, etc. Do you automatically exclude certain neighborhoods as places you might live or send your kids to school? Do you only date a certain type? And do you have a quote unquote gay friend or a quote unquote Black doctor? And even if you do have those people, what this question is getting at is how you introduce them or how you identify them. If you say, this is my friend, this is my Black friend, Nicole, that's one thing. But again, it's not a problem to have me as your friend. It's just, if that's how you only identify me, that's a form of implicit bias. Or if you say, I have Black friends, I can't be racist. That's another no. It doesn't mean that you can't be racist, or it doesn't mean that you can't be prejudiced. There are things that we all hold, again, regardless of the systems or the families that we sit in. So one thing that I would offer, and we don't have time to do it today, but when I send the PDF of the slides, the link is embedded. It's the implicit association test. And this comes from Harvard. So if you were to click on this test, and you may have done it already, it will actually take you through a number of mini tests, and you can see kind of where you favor as far as your biases. Some people go to political affiliation. Some people have biases about weight and height. Some people have biases about gender. And of course, biases about race. And so this particular test, you can select any one of those categories and decide kind of where you favor. And interestingly, you can ask yourself, were you surprised by any of those outcomes, or did it kind of jive with what you think anyway? But it's a nice test to start helping people know what their implicit biases might be. So I would offer, as we think back to the principal in our case study, if we think about her approach as she's teaching implicit bias or introducing implicit bias, something like this could be an entry point for people that have not heard of it before, and provide them with a grounding or a level of understanding on what you might be talking about when you talk about implicit bias. So I just wanted you to have the ability to access that as well. The next piece, or the tool that I think is important to think about, is the ladder of inference. So the ladder of inference essentially takes you on a journey in your brain. And in your brain, you do have a little mini ladder. You observe data, you select data, you add meaning, I'm moving up the ladder, you make assumptions, you draw conclusions, adopt beliefs, and then take action. So pretend in your head that you have like a video camera inside your brain. When you see something, you take that information in and you start to put all these different pieces of the ladder to them, and your beliefs end up influencing the ultimate action that you take. Again, for time's sake, I would show a video. So I'd like for you to think about looking at, and I'm going to put it in the chat right now, and you can just YouTube it. It is Rethinking Thinking by Trevor Maber. Okay. And it's about a 4-minute clip. And it gives a nice brief overview. I would also encourage you, if you're sharing this content, if you're turning around training to other staff members, this is a nice clip that can easily help them understand the ladder of inference. But what I'm going to do is provide you an example of a school setting. And in this example, this is a student sleeping in class. So at the very bottom of the rung, or at the bottom of the ladder, under number 1 is the experience. So I'm a teacher. The experience I'm taking into my video camera in my brain is that I see a student with their head on the desk. The data I then apply on rung 2 is that the student must be sleeping. In rung 3, my thoughts begin, students who want to learn stay awake. At number 4, I put an assumption on top of that and say, this student's not energetic about learning. Then I add a conclusion, student doesn't want to learn. Then I put my beliefs on top of that. Student and anyone associated doesn't want to learn. And then number 7, the action I take is to actively work to remove that student from my room. And this happens all the time. So what they suggest when thinking about the ladder of inference is, how do we interrupt our ladder? So instead of us moving so quickly up these rungs to an action, how do we take a pause somewhere and stop that movement so that we can think differently or behave differently? So what's suggested is, we see the experience, we apply the data, we put the meaning, we make the assumption, but before we get to number 5, what if we were to tap that young person on the shoulder and say, hey, what's going on? You're tired? What's happening? Student says, I had to sit up with my brother last night. My mom worked the late shift, so I'm just really tired, Ms. Hollins. I didn't mean to sleep in your class. That interruption will prevent me from moving further up the ladder to ultimately working to move that student out of my room. And that's what we want teachers and staff members to begin to think about. Again, in the heat of the moment, you're moving up the ladder quick. You don't really see this step-by-step process happen, but it's taking that pause and that breath, what Kent McIntosh would call a neutralizing routine, that instead of moving right swiftly to a disciplinary referral, I'm taking a pause, I'm counting to 5, I'm doing whatever I need to bring myself down and ask a question or seek understanding, and then determine what the appropriate action might be. It still might be that you need to write the student up because they may react differently than the example I provided, but at least you've taken the time to interrupt your ladder of inference and didn't allow your implicit bias to take hold. And so what does bias and disproportionate outcomes actually lend themselves to? So these are just a couple examples. Less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall, yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Disproportionate. 13% of the US population is Black, yet 40% of those incarcerated are Black. Disproportionate, big time. And I'm going to show you a stat in a minute that's going to blow your mind. The next one, that's not it, but the next one is 3% of advertising creative directors are women, yet almost 51% of the American population are female. And so that's pretty deep because when you think about women, so I'm talking to the women on the call, when you're in your car, where do you put your purse? We don't have a space for our purse. We have to be creative. We have to put it on the floor or put it on our seat. And if we were in creative directing or creating systems or allowed to, we would have created a place for the purse in the car. There was a great presenter from our computer science summit, and she used to work for the Obama administration. And she said, that is the #1 question she always says to people when they talk about why don't we engage women in certain things like STEM or computer science? And she's like, it's so clear that we're not at the table because there would be different things that we would see out in the universe that would speak to being responsive to women. And the same can apply to any culture. Thinking about facial recognition on our iPhones or on our different devices, a lot of facial recognition devices aren't built for darker skin. They don't recognize the skin as well. And those are things that digital equity speaks to. So all of these disproportionate outcomes lend themselves to bias. So here's the statistics that I just think might blow your mind, might actually confirm what you thought. The first one is Black students made up 13.6% of Pennsylvania students, but received almost half of out-of-school suspensions. What does that stat look like? What did we just see here? 13% of the US population is Black, however, yet 40% are incarcerated. Looks vaguely familiar. That's why people say school to prison pipeline. Because we are starting as early as preschool even on identifying students that need discipline at a different rate or in a different way than their peers. And it's translating into societal things that we see play out. Students with disabilities are almost twice as likely as non-disabled students to receive out-of-school suspension, 11% versus close to 6%. Another thing to consider is the concept of intersectionality. What that means is if you have multiple identities converging. So if you're a Black student with a disability, the likelihood of your disciplinary outcomes tends to multiply. So you just think about how intersections of identities can also play a role. Pennsylvania is one of 11 states where the difference in suspension rates between Black and white students is higher than the national average for both male and female students. Data that's important, data to know, and important for us to do something different. So I just wanted to highlight that. Another piece to highlight here comes from Princeton University. There's an article that was released that looked at relative risk ratios by county, and this was 2016. So just to kind of really summarize this briefly, if you look for anything in yellow, that suggests a high risk ratio, which indicates in this case, 4.51 to infinity. So let's just say in one county in yellow, Black students are 4.5 times more likely to receive a, and you fill in the blank, suspension, expulsion, restraint, etc. The data in the article speaks to each one of those. I don't have time to unpack all of it, but I wanted to highlight that unfortunately, Pennsylvania is leading the way, quote unquote. We are very much a yellow state. And what that speaks to, and I can speak to my county, this map is an interactive map in the article. You can hover over your county. Granted, we are not a county-based educational system, but it gives you a sense by county of the likelihood of certain students receiving an outcome. And in this case, it's focusing on Black students versus white students. In Dauphin County, it is 7.5, which indicates that in Dauphin County, Black students are 7.5 times more likely to receive a suspension than their white peers. What that says to me as a mother of a Black son who's turning 3 is that if my son goes to kindergarten in 2 years, when he steps in the door, he is already 7.5 times more likely to receive a suspension than his best friend who is white, simply because he's a Black boy. And that's unacceptable to me. And it should be unacceptable for all of us. Because if that were your grandchild, if that were your cousin, your niece, your nephew, your niece, your child, it would be unacceptable. So something has to change around that data, and something has to change around this overall work. And it's why equity is so important, and why we cannot say it's overplayed or it's a buzzword. I don't have time to go through all of this because we are coming down to the end. But I think what I'm going to do is actually stop here and see if there are questions. And Karen, you can feel free to unmute if there's any other housekeeping items. I hate to break at this point this way, but I didn't want to just jump right into a whole new section with the time I'm running out.
Paula, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I admit I was talking about you behind your back, and I asked everyone on chat whether they would be interested in a part 2.
Okay.
And I got a resounding yes. So thank you so much for sharing just a piece of your vast knowledge on this subject. Clearly everyone enjoyed it.
Good.
And I'm going to try to bring you back as soon as possible.
That sounds awesome. No, I'm happy to come back. 2 hours and I get wordy. So I was like, I'm talking too much. But at the same time, I was hoping that it made sense and that people were receiving, and it sounds that way. So really excited that you're willing to have me back.
Very well received. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So I'm going to put my email in the chat if that's okay. And then if there are questions in between now and the next time I see you, please don't hesitate to reach out. And Karen, if there are any housekeeping items, please don't hesitate, feel free.
Okay, just a reminder to send me your evaluation. I will have your certificate sent to you as soon as possible, definitely in the next couple of days, as long as I have your completed evaluation. Anyone have any questions for me or for Nicole?
I think we're good.
Well, then I would say have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Hope to see you soon. Karen, there was a question about accessing the evaluation.
Accessing it?
Mm-hmm.
It was sent to them, I believe, by Pam.
Okay.
Pam, did you send it to them?
Let me unmute Pam.
There were a few people that I not have on my list, but I do have their names, so I'll get an email out to them as soon as I leave.
Okay. Yeah. Well, there's 2 things you could do. You could have it sent to you and me. Want to do that? They could
I
just
had,
click.
I had said to send it to me so that I could do the certificate right away. Then I would forward it on to you.
That's fine.
Irregardless, we'll get it.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm serious, Nicole. I immediately, as soon as you like made that like off the cuff offer, I was like, I'm going to take her up on this before she changes her mind.
No, that's
It was
totally
great. You did a
fine.
wonderful job. And I kept thinking about that quote, the more you know, the more you realize how little you really know. And so
Mhm.
I think, you opened up a lot of minds and hearts, and 2 hours wasn't enough. It's enough time that you're happy to stand up and get off of your, seat, but it's not enough to get all the information that you were hoping to leave us with.
Yeah, in certain sections, I spent a little bit more time than I anticipated, but I just felt like there was stuff I wanted to make sure we were all clear on. So I didn't want to take that for granted, that everybody had the same level of knowledge around certain things. So that was the reason it kind of went longer than I expected, but I'm happy to do part twos. That actually allows me to create something different and maybe
Yeah.
get more interaction. So,
Are you going to be around in January?
yep, I'll be around whenever you need me.
Okay, I'll look at some January possible dates, and I'll get in touch with you. But
Okay.
yeah, it was excellent, really.
Oh,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Yeah, and I'll make sure that you get like a collated copy of the evaluations.
Okay,
Okay,
that
and
sounds
you're
great.
sending the PowerPoint to me, right? Okay.
Yep, I'm gonna, soon as we are done, actually, I can stop recording now.